Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Live Your True Story. This is your host, Miyoke Ikaro. I'm really pleased to bring this episode to you today with Dale Grunsvold. He's been dutifully narrating all of Rudolf Steiner's books, and I don't know a whole lot about Steiner. I think I knew more then than I do now because I had kind of gotten into him, but it was really fun to revisit this interview. And actually, there's a lot that Rudolf Steiner has to offer, I think, to the plant medicine space. I actually recently contacted Dale and discovered that 10 years ago, when we recorded this, was his very first podcast interview. So I feel like I found gold, and now he's out in the world talking about Rudolf Steiner and sharing information about him. And he's such an eloquent speaker. I recently gave a talk, a 90-minute talk about initiation and really seeing this work as initiation and trying to sort of piece together what exactly that means and bringing in initiation theory, seeing what does and doesn't apply to the plant medicine space, and looking at a variety of indigenous initiations. And I think Steiner also has something to offer to the space because he was initiated, I believe, in various esoteric traditions. And so I really look forward to circling back around to Dale now that my understanding of plant medicine has really evolved, and also to really dig into more of what Rudolf Steiner has to offer in that area. One of the things that Rudolf Steiner really, really, really emphasized was that it's super ideal to be prepared for initiatory experiences. This is part of the sort of universal template of all indigenous cultures is huge preparation. And in a society that really values peak experiences, that is really sort of taking these indigenous medicines and bringing them into our more drug and addiction paradigm, preparation and integration really get lost. And usually, when people come to their first retreat, these are things that they put a lot more value in the second time because they kind of had to go through that experience to realize how important that was, and to see how much more they would have gotten out of it, and how certain things may have been done the hard way when there were actually more graceful ways to go through them. If you're planning to work with sacred medicines, if you've worked with sacred medicines and you would like a consultation or some support, you can always check out my website at holdingcompassionate.space. In this conversation, we touch upon the sciences, and there's a whole thing that I could probably go into, and maybe I will in a future monologue. But I always think about how interesting it is that science is all predicated on math, and yet the loudest scientists tend to be very outspoken atheists and materialists. But most mathematicians believe in God, like 95% or something like that. And, or I should say a higher power, because God is quite a loaded term. But yeah, but they believe in a higher consciousness. And like 99% of Nobel Prize winners believe in a higher power. And the greatest mathematical minds of the 20th century, Alexander Grothendieck and Srinivasa Ramanujan, both were really intense mystics. Like Srinivasa Ramanujan spent his life essentially in a temple with like an old calculus book, like old for the early 1900s. He was in a poor village. That was the only math book he had. He got all of his insights into mathematics that we're still trying to figure out from that time in the temple, chanting and getting down with what we talk about in this conversation, which is, where you have the intersection of science and mystery and the sacred and mathematics, where all of that meets. The earliest scientific texts that exist in the West are epic poetry. You have like the nature of things by Lucretius, and you have this as well again in Germany. You have Goethe doing science. and writing great epic poetry in these great moments of human progress. You always have polymaths. It's just the way it is. Moses was a polymath, all these guys. So, and gals, and gals. Uh, and I think in some way you do get that with Steiner. We also mentioned a guy named Swedenborg who was sort of like that as well. I think he kind of birthed actually existentialism, sort of the first to do that. But he was an interesting guy too. And I have in the archives an interview with Gary Lockman, who many know as the guitarist for Blondie. But in his second act, he started writing a whole lot of biographies and books on mystics, including Rudolf Steiner. So I'll be posting that in the future as well. One of the things that I want to mention as well about how we disconnect and how we stay disconnected, and for those of us who can have the courage to come out of the spiritual closet, like that would flip the world upside down, I think, because people are sort of two minds. Like, in the public sphere, it's like, oh, science all the way and this and that. But privately, they'll tell you about really high level unexplained experiences, like when somebody close to them passed and maybe they saw them in a vision, or, saw them like physically, and they didn't even know that they had passed. But people have these experiences all the time. And I think, when you actually look at these surveys, that like the vast majority of people believe in prayer. I mean, people have faith and they have a spiritual life, but there's some sort of disconnect, right, through the taboo in the modern public sphere of dogmatic science. I remember another guy who I interviewed, a guy named Dean Radin, who worked in like paranormal studies and stuff for US intelligence. I interviewed him. I interviewed a lot of wild people back then. Um, but I remember in his book, I'm pretty sure it was his book, that he was talking to, big academics and psychology departments and things like that. And he was talking to two men who were particularly tortured because they, had very taboo thoughts and had made very inconvenient observations. And the thing was, they worked in the same department of the same university. Like they were down the hall from each other. But because they didn't come out, they couldn't find each other. And so they were really tortured because it was like, why am I the only gay Eskimo? And of course, this works in my space as well. People confide in me, they're dealing with things. And, sometimes I'll hear 3 or 4 clients say the same thing in the same day, connecting with the supernatural or having, really taboo experiences. And, because of client confidentiality, I'm the only one who knows this, but it's interesting to be in this sort of privileged position where I actually get to see the landscape, like standing on a hill or something and kind of seeing a bigger picture of things, because there's something about the private space that tells you what's really happening. Like I remember when I lived in Cambridge and I made a friend who I met actually. He's a young man with schizophrenia who drank ayahuasca because that's not a deal breaker the way, Western medicine will tell you. Like it's definitely a deal breaker if you do it their way, but when you work with real healers, it's not there's actually plants that address things like that and bipolar and all that kind of stuff. But anyway, he was really, he's a really brilliant guy in his training. He was at Harvard for a postdoc. And he told me this really interesting story. He told me about how the guy who was training him, because he was actually there to do a postdoc with a neurosurgeon, and so they actually performed neurosurgery on mice for their research. And his mentor, the guy who led the lab, is a Muslim guy, and very, very devout. And he said that before they did surgery on these mice, that this guy would always pray over them. Like he would hold his hands above them and pray for them. And their survival rate was like off the charts. Like almost every single mouse survived. Whereas in everybody else's labs, like 90% weren't coming back. And, we just sort of talked about that, about how, like, this is like not something this guy shares with his colleagues, like this is not even something my friend tells other people. You just told me because we're like, ayahuasca people. But when you make yourself available to private knowledge, you get to know things. You get to be the person that a gay person comes out to. You get to be the person who knows about Me Too and Bill Cosby and whoever else way before it goes out to the public. So, like, sometimes we say we want to know things, but it's more about becoming the kinds of people who get to know things. And for that, sometimes it requires coming out. Something we talk about as well is celibacy. And I think in a future episode, I'll go deeper into that. I have a long practice of celibacy. Obviously, I'm doing it for this 1 year diet, but it's been years of real spiritual celibacy. And so I have some insights to share about what that does for a person. Not that it like gives you powers per se, but it does really give you a clarity. And, if you think about all of the time and energy most people spend thinking about sex, thinking about romance and all of that. It's kind of like if you have kids, like if you thought about not having kids, like all of a sudden, wow, there's a lot of energy, a lot of free time, and a lot of different options to put that incredible amount of time and energy into. And so at some point I'll try to speak about that as well. And if there's anything that any of you are interested in having me talk about in this process, please shoot me a note. I'd be happy to go into it. Just a few final notes before we hop into the conversation. We talk a little bit about some philosophers, Kant. I did a series with Peter Park where we're kind of going after him, but he really is a huge figure in philosophy as well. Like everybody has light and dark. And he did some really interesting things for metaphysics and for grounding science, for better or for worse, as a real pillar of the modern age. He did create a proof between Leibniz and Newton that really helped physics move forward and really kind of closed the book on a huge debate that was going on about space and time at the time. So he's really big. And then after him came Hegel. And he's also a huge philosopher. And his whole thing was like history, and he talked about like a dialectic of history, which is sort of like a fancy way of saying that, there's sort of like this conversation. And I haven't read Hegel in forever, but basically that there's sort of like different forces and that history is moving like in some sort of like self-directed or conscious direction, from what I remember. And then we also talk about Goethe. And Goethe is one of those guys where you're like, who? But it's because his name is spelled super German. So his name is spelled Goethe. So you wouldn't be like, oh yeah, obviously that's pronounced Goethe. But in the German, it's very German. And he was a huge polymath. A lot of us know him usually in university. He wrote Faust, just a really great poet. He wrote the Erlkönig, which is like a incredible and dark poem from Faust that like they read to children. So that explains a lot of Germany for people to have Goethe there. He also wrote The Sorrows of Young Werther, which, man, it's kind of hard to understand the impacts people had. So The Sorrows of Young Werther was about this young man who was smitten with a young lady from his village, and she married, another dude, and he killed himself. And it's a slim book, and you can't, I don't, I haven't been able to find a copy of it, of the original, because later he went back and expanded it because It was called Werther fever. People were like throwing themselves out of moving horse carriages. They were drowning themselves in like just this whole romantic fever of unrequited love sparked like a cultural phenomenon of lovelorn people committing suicide. And, later on, people finding like literally jumping out of horse carriages with this book clutched to their breast, and, somebody jumping out of a window, and then people finding the book under their pillow. So it was like this whole entire thing. But also, this guy, he made some contributions to science, I believe, with light and chemistry. And, sometimes he would write about these things again, like kind of in the old school ancient style. Like he would write about it as a play, but with characters, with like human characters. But actually, these characters represented certain chemicals and elements of the universe. So he's huge. It's kind of like if Shakespeare had also been Leonardo da Vinci or something like that. Just Goethe was a huge mind with kind of a weird name. We also talk about phenomenology, and phenomenology is a branch of philosophy that focused on the structures of conscious experience. Like it started with phenomena, like from the first person perspective. Whereas like Kant was like, oh no, the thing in itself. Like we know the thing, the outside thing. And so let's figure out what reason is. But phenomenology was really trying to get inside the lived experience. It's really interested in things like perception and emotion and memory, and really trying to get into subjective meaning rather than like a sort of more sterile study of like causes. So when we mention phenomenology, we're like really that's the study of like exploring the essence of experience, trying to get inside how it is that we experience the world and what those structures might look like. Philosophy's fun. Reading it's not fun, but the ideas are fun. And so you have Steiner, who was a scientific mind, and also this guy who was having these like next level spiritual experiences, which actually can be explained in an interesting way with the Shipibo, actually. I think I know what his diagnosis was and what they do for him. But anyway, he had these deeply spiritual experiences, and yet he had this really rigorous scientific education. So he really came at it in institutions, but as a minority, like not as like an actual cultural minority, but as like an experiential minority. And so he kind of brought these two things together, like he kind of brought phenomenology together with reason, with science, and said like a lot of what our culture would think is like a lot of weird shit. But what's interesting about him is that he did have all of these credentials. Like he was approached to be the archivist of Nietzsche's library, and he was the lead archivist of Immanuel Kant's whole corpus. He was like legit, as we might say, and yet he kind of wandered off into these other areas. And so it was great to talk to Dale, who knows so much about Steiner, and be able to have this really interesting conversation with him. And I'm so looking forward to having him back on the podcast. I shot him an email and he's like, hey. So keep an eye out for that. Keep an eye out for future episodes from the archives. And in the meantime, I will continue to try to get out more episodes with the Shipibo, as well as some more monologues with different variations on a theme, especially as I move forward with these 2-year-long dietas and as I move into hosting 5 retreats this summer with the family. So stay tuned, and please welcome Dale Grunsvold. Thank you for joining me today. I'm very excited to talk Rudolf Steiner with you.
Great. I'd love to share about him.
Just to start, I'll let everybody know that I found you because you have a website called rudolfsteineraudio.com. And that is where you have recorded his lectures, many of his books. It seems like you've read almost everything he's written out loud.
That would be a feat. Actually, his collected works is still being put together in some ways, and it's about 360 volumes. And most of that was about 6,000 lectures and about, I think, 50 or 60 written works. And I have about 130 up, so I'm just a little over a third of the way.
Wow. Yeah, and you're such a great reader. I feel like it really makes his words come alive because a lot of people have trouble with his writing style.
Yes, I've heard that, and I thank you for your compliment.
So what inspired you to start doing this? How did you come to Rudolf Steiner?
Well, I guess I was in college and a philosophy degree, which I don't think I ever got a very solid grounding in, but I enjoyed it immensely, and it's still an abiding interest even to this day. But partly was reading a book of his on epistemology, on how we come to know, that struggled with Kant's claim that there's an actual limit to what the human being can ultimately learn, that there's limits to our knowledge based on, if you remember his work, essentially these aspects of our apprehension through our physical senses and through the cognitive forms in our mental ability that only give us a picture of the world that isn't at all necessarily what the world itself is. And Steiner says, well, let's look at that. And he doesn't really ever attack things. He just takes what has sort of occurred in the past and feels kind of had a truth in its own time, and then bring it into the present in a certain way to show where, certain aspects of it can now be looked at and possibly taken a step further, if I could put it there. I hope I'm not getting too abstruse here in this discussion.
Well, actually, that was kind of one of the places that I wanted you to take us, because it seems as though all of modern science seems to sort of rest on Immanuel Kant.
I wonderfully agree with you.
Yes. And what's interesting to me historically is that there was a counterbalance to Kant in his day, and that seemed to be Goethe.
Yes, absolutely. What we could call really romantic phenomenology, in the sense of Owen Barfield would say that. I love that phrase.
So we're in the era of, let's see, Schiller and William Blake and Coleridge and
Very nice.
The
yes.
romantics of that era then.
Yes, and Hegel and Novalis and Goethe, who are all friends as well in Germany.
Well, and Hegel's a funny one because he is typically, at least in philosophy departments, he tends to be grouped with Kant. You get Kant, then Hegel. And Goethe seems to get really lost. If anybody knows who he is, they just know that he wrote Faust.
Yes.
And he was such a huge presence. And he's so overlooked, especially, I feel like, in American society. And certainly, I think that you'd be hard-pressed to find him in a philosophy department. Can you tell us a little bit about what Steiner did? Because he's someone who, as you mentioned, was very interested in Kant. And at the same time, he also went, I think, equally as deeply into Goethe. Can you tell us kind of why he was interested in these two minds?
Nice question. Actually, when he was about 26, he was put in charge at a very young age of editing Goethe's scientific writings. And even before then, I think he'd studied them. In particular with Goethe, I think what he found fascinating, given Steiner's own, exceptional cognitive abilities, is that he sensed in him someone who had gotten very close to the threshold of a transformation in his ability to cognize the world. And he did this because of kind of the orientation that, even though it might have been unconscious, let's say in Goethe, he nevertheless was going for. And that was that we could train, and I'm going to do my best with this.
Sure.
we could train our subjective experience so that it had a lawful objectivity. And that amounted to what you could call, in Germanic kind of phraseology, a sensorially exact fantasy. And so what he did is he looked into the world with his physical senses. As a phenomenologist, let's say, he didn't dwell on the kind of corpse-like aspect of all physical things. He studied that carefully, as we know as well. But he brought into that with this kind of attempt at a truly living imagination, a lawful, not a fantastic one, but a lawful imagination of bringing the processes of life and unfoldment and metamorphosis about in his ability to, let's say, directly perceive. So that life itself, he attempted, again, I'm saying he got to the threshold of actually perceiving kind of life itself in the way that it metamorphosed, let's say, in the growth of a plant. And so in this, he says that there's this training that occurs. The other place he did this that is really overlooked, as you mentioned, is in his theory of color, which Beethoven, by the way, thought was one of the greatest books in 1770 he'd ever read. And I do have that on the website, by the way. I was asked to read that by a third party, and I did that. So I also have a copy of Goethe's Theory of Color on the website for a free download. But in that, again, he says, color, in a certain sense, affects us objectively, that blue actually produces a subjective experience objectively. I get carried away, forgive me, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we know now, in a certain sense, from art therapy,
right,
and in many other experiments that have been done in this field, although they're not well known, and a person I know, Dennis Kloczek, who I consider one of the greatest working anthroposophists in America, and his DennisKloczek.com, Kloczek, has some wonderful discussions about this, but how color actually affects us. And in Waldorf schools, as you know, one of Steiner's creations, the walls are very consciously painted in certain colors for each of the grades, again, based on this aspect of color and its relationship to our soul life. How's that for a beginning?
That's wonderful. You know, the thing about Steiner is that he reminds me a bit of Aristotle in the sense that he's so diverse in his interests, but he's got such a huge system that it's very difficult to figure out exactly what your entry point will be. And at the same time, it seems like it's so easy to only know one aspect of his thought as well, because each aspect of his thought is sort of a universe in its own.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more, and what a fantastic person to relate him to.
Well, see, a lot of people don't know who Rudolf Steiner is, even though their kids go to a Waldorf school. And my personal opinion is that if every public school in America became a Waldorf school, we'd have a great society in about 10 to 20 years.
Yeah, yes. Again, given all the foibles and efforts of human beings attempting to realize an idea, right? We're all struggling with that. But I'm having a dream conversation here. But yes.
Well, so everything starts with education. Certainly Plato and Aristotle knew that. In Plato's Republic, as I'm sure you know, it starts with how you educate people, the noble lies you tell them, and all of those types of things. So many of Rudolf Steiner's writings is about how human beings learn. You really have to sort of, for those of us who have been so indoctrinated and brainwashed in the West, so much unlearning has to occur first. And I was wondering if you could sort of describe, I guess, the background philosophy of Waldorf schools and how differently they function and what the basis is fundamentally between how they perceive what human beings are so that you can actually teach them.
So a lot of that goes back, I think, to something that really does touch on all of Steiner's work and is sort of one of those fundamental frameworks. And if you wouldn't mind, I could give a little bit of that and you could help me out because you've probably read some of this before. But this has to do with, when we want to teach a human being, we should have a picture of what a human being is, in a certain sense, in front of us. And in what we have in our modern society, if I can say this way, is essentially that we're either some kind of machine or some kind of elaborated animal. And because we actually, however consciously or unconsciously, carry those pictures of the human being, we then form our educational structures and our intentions and our goodwill based on that picture. So let's turn to what Steiner says. Steiner says, and he's very serious about this, and this was a big deal for me when I read this when I was 22. Everything, it's like I opened like a flower in a certain sense. And he talked about, he said, really, as a clairvoyant, he more or less is saying, I'm going to talk to you about a human being and relate this human being to the world around you. And so here we do indeed have this physical body, and let's look at that glorious mineral kingdom. which we can bow down to in gratitude for far in the past already preparing for this body that we now have of physical substances. Then he says, but when we look at the plant kingdom, we see that something has happened, and he characterizes it somewhat this way, that a body of forces has taken up physical matter from the mineral kingdom and raised it into a different and higher, let's argue, level of organization. And we call that a body of life forces, or as he calls them later in life, formative forces. And he says, and if we look at that, we'll say that a human being actually has, but in a far more complex and elevated way, that we have this body of life forces in us, or that is part of us. And in fact, in us, it holds our memory life in a very special way and is sort of the foundation of all the thinking processes that go on in the human organism as it metamorphoses through its life. Yes? Then he says, well, then let's look at the animal kingdom. There we see something has happened, speaking phenomenologically. Something has changed. And he argues, again, it gets more and more subtle as we get to these higher realms, but that there's another body of different forces. He calls them the forces of consciousness, or that abide in the nerve sense system of the animal, that bestow sentience, that actually begin in the beginnings of an inner life, where passions and instincts and drives and impulses and sentience and the processing of sense perception is all going on. And we have that body of forces. He uses later in life the nerves sense system, the consciousness forces. From the old theosophical vocabulary, he uses also the word the astral body. But he's very scientific and phenomenological about these ideas. None of this is fantastical because it's all applied in biodynamic agriculture and in Waldorf education and anthroposophical medicine. This is what really tied me into it all and made it all come to life for me rather than being beautiful ideas, if I may say. And then finally, the fourth, and this is really something, now this is crucial to the picture of the human being that Waldorf schools abide by, if they're really Waldorf schools. And that is, and then given these three friends, let's say, almost in the Jobian sense from the book of Job, these three friends of our physical body and our body of life forces and our astral body or body of consciousness forces, into this, right, comes in a spiritual being that is a reincarnating individuality. And as it enters into these three bodies, it wrestles with heredity forces that are coming from the parents. It finds karmic things that it has to begin to grapple with in this life. And for a Waldorf teacher, can you imagine, even if this is a wrong picture, how glorious the intentions are then behind the teacher? Sees a human being this way, sees this emerging individuality, sees their job, as Steiner says, if I can almost quote this, to remove the hindrances that are there so that the human individuality can be as complete in this incarnation as it can be, so it can grow to the fullest of its potential. And so they're there with this, and so they pray at night and dream of their children, if they're Waldorf teachers, and carry day in and day out a certain, shall we say, grace-filled attention, yes, that they carry with these children, even that coming out of a person's heart. You can imagine how that must affect a child in their education. Okay, I'll stop there.
Well, the biggest contrast that I see between a Steiner education and whatever the hell we're doing now in the public realm is that in public schools and also in private schools, you have the child as machine. And you're trying to, if they were a piece of marble, you're trying to sculpt them into these perfect cubes so that they could all be the same and be good little worker bees in the capitalist, scientific, modern world. And Steiner is looking at it a little bit more the way Michelangelo is said to have looked at a statue. He saw the chunk of marble, and then he was able to see the statue trying to break out, and he's trying to free it so that it can be what it already is. And it seems to me that really illustrates quite well what Rudolf Steiner saw in each child in terms of their education.
Wonderful analogy. Absolutely wonderful.
You're not trying to stamp out who they are, who they were when they were born, with those unique forces that, frankly, none of us really truly understand, instead of trying to oppress and get them to shove it down so that they can function for these machine purposes.
Yeah, the individuality, I mean, it is scary if we can't carry a spiritual picture of the human being in some way that's non-dogmatic, right, that's not coercive, because in those realms it equally can be coercive, as you mentioned, like, let's say, the Catholic schools or something. And that's the secret, because we don't know what the spirit in the future can unfold, right? That's open territory. So in a Walter School, there's, I think, a deep implicit excitement in what is this child bringing into the world that I can help them do this in their individuality. Yeah.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about his biography, because his life is very interesting. And looking backward from a future point in history, we see him as a clairvoyant. We see him more in this very esoteric realm, but he didn't really start that way. I put him in the same camp as Swedenborg. Do you know who that is?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah, they're both just these really highly trained, brilliant scientists, perhaps the most brilliant scientists of their era. And they both seem to have some sort of, Gary Lockman calls it a creative illness, whereas shamanic practitioners will call them sacred illness. And they both seem to have these sort of spiritual or psychosomatic crises that change them. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit specifically about Rudolf Steiner's education, because as you mentioned, he was put in charge of the Goethe archives for his scientific writings, which is huge. Goethe isn't big in American society, but he is Shakespeare in Germany.
Yes.
And also a good bit of Europe. I mean, he's really, once you know about Goethe, he's almost everything after that. And so, yeah, I'd like to get a little bit more of a solidified background. I know that he also was offered by Nietzsche's sister to be Nietzsche's archivist after he was dead as well. So he's just a very esteemed scholar, and he went to, like, the Vienna version of MIT. And so can you tell us a little bit about the shift that occurred from him being so highly trained in the rationalistic material sciences, and then what took him beyond this into this other realm?
I'll do my best, and some of it is still something I struggle with. I don't know if we've ever had a really great biography yet, even though a couple have recently come out, one by Peter Selg, which is going to be 7 volumes in English when it eventually gets, there's 2 of them now translated, and then one that was finally translated by, again, Steiner Books, who are, I may say, steinerbooks.org is a wonderful organization that allows me to record Steiner, which is a very, very generous action on their part, and I hope everybody appreciates that about that. A man named Christoph Lindenberg also wrote a biography of Steiner that was a 2-volume that they put together, and is pretty good, I think, but again, hard to measure that. Steiner's birthday actually is in 2 days. So he was born on February 25th in 1861, and he was in a very rural part, as they say, somewhere between Austria and what is now Croatia, almost on the border, in a town called something else now. I think it was called Kraljevec, and I'm giving it my best pronunciation there. Of Austrian parents that weren't in their neighborhood anymore. They were out, away from their people, and that's kind of interesting. But we could say that Steiner always had an abiding spiritual life and an abiding spiritual vision that he carried with him quietly from pretty early on. If I may say that, that's pretty much what the biographies agree on. And when he was at about, I think, 9, either 7 or 9, forgive me for not knowing the exact date, he had a spiritual experience while sitting in a train station of a woman, and this woman appealed to him for help. And he was sort of taken aback. Something about the experience was unusual to him, and he didn't know why. And then when he went home later, he realized that his mother's sister had died, or possibly it was the father again. I'm sorry about the details. And he realized that this person, when she had committed suicide, had come to him. And he kind of mentioned this and was, the parents were quite upset that he said this. And so he never again, really from then on, shared these experiences that it appears he was constantly having. So that's an interesting thing. On the other hand, he does talk in his life, in his autobiography, about his inability to really take hold of the sensory world very well. He lived in a certain way in kind of this entrancing spiritual experience, elemental beings and all this kind of thing that he was experiencing. And the physical world, it took him until he was much older than most people to really grasp onto this, even though his education, he did quite well when he finally was in his 7 to 14-year period there. He did well in school, and the parents saw this, and the father was very much involved in his kids having a good education. So he did well. So anyway, so we have that quietly in the background from then on, and then Steiner grows through and eventually, as you said, goes to the Technische Hochschule in Vienna, which is pretty much the MIT of its day. They say he graduated more or less with like a PhD or a master's in analytic mechanics, which is pretty much the heart of hard sciences. Along the way, because he was very poor, so the sayings go in all these books, these biographies, he taught himself the entire gymnasium curriculum. And he did it out of necessity, and that was he tutored people in Greek and Latin and in the humanities of that time in order to have enough money to survive. So that's, I found, quite fascinating as well. And then she worked at a workers' college for 7 years in Berlin. But I'm a little confused that might be after the time in Weimar. So he was in Weimar for a time doing Goethe's scientific writings when he was 26, and then in the workers' college, which was a Marxist school, which is interesting. And, was very beloved by the students of his time there as well. So finally, to say what happened, well, I think partly he gave a talk to the Count Brockdorf people. This was in about 1899, right in close to 1900, on, was it Goethe's Secret Revelation, it might be. It was either that or The Green Snake and the Beautiful Lily, which is one of these famous fairy tales of Goethe's. And they were so intrigued that they asked him to come back. Well, it turned out that these people were part of the burgeoning Theosophical Society, which had been founded in 1875 in America, right? And Steiner realized that he had come upon a group of people that would listen to his esoteric insights. And because he found them in a certain way, he spoke about it. And, that's where that all began. But I don't think in a way it was a transition as much as, even though it was, of course, all of his scholarly people shunned him from then on for the most part, right? And then his path went in that direction. Now, that's my understanding, and forgive me for not being more scholarly about it, because the details I still struggle with them. But
well, they're not so readily available, especially with figures like Steiner, where he's not part of the canon. And despite the fact that he's well-educated and erudite, even my understanding of his PhD is they gave him his PhD, but because the ideas, he did well at defending it, and his ideas were sound, but he totally did things the way he wanted to do them.
I think that's really true, and all the way through his life, yeah.
Yeah, it reminds me a little bit of Nietzsche in that respect, where they just had to give him a PhD, because what else are you going to do? But the thing about Steiner that really struck me is that he was the first person that I read about. I read tons of biographies, but he's the first person that I read, and I realized that you can be spiritually in the closet. And when I read about how tortured he was by having kept this vision that he had when he was still, single digits. And he didn't come out until he was like 46, I think. He never told a soul.
Yeah, pretty much 40. It was about 40 years old. So 1861, and this in 1900 was when that kind of all officially began, yeah.
Right. And it reminded me of homosexuals.
Ah.
And I thought, man, it's a very similar closet. Here's this guy who had this other experience that was very, very real for him, that the scientific community and the religious community were telling him was a no-go. Yet he knew that it was true, and he had to really keep that inside for decades and decades, his adult life almost.
Yeah, in a sense, when you think in our age as well, unless you abide by a certain form of religion that the world finds acceptable, even though it kind of rolls its eyes about it, something like Steiner's work is still extremely vilified once people touch it at all. It still makes people very angry. If you're a believer in a religion with all these belief systems, they figure, yeah, well, that's what you're going to do, and we've compartmentalized everything, but don't start sticking your nose in science or anything like that, right? And as I understand it, he's being extremely attacked, like in Germany, quite a bit. Here, he's hardly known, right? So we don't hear about that. But in Germany, there's reams written on him to try to kind of get him out of the picture as fast as they can.
Well, the thing is in the Netherlands, they have Waldorf schools everywhere.
That's true.
And
I've never been to the Netherlands, but everything I read about them, from their environmental policies to just the way they run their society, it's so smart. And again, like I said, if we had public Steiner schools, I think that our society would be a nicely well-oiled machine.
Now, there's a Milwaukee public school that's an inner city school that's been Waldorf-based for maybe a decade or more now. Do you know of that?
No, wow.
Okay. You might look into having somebody talk about that. I have seen a little PhD on the web that was by someone, and, it's very interesting because they can, again, take Waldorf and shape it to the, as it were, cultural specifics of their demographic, as it were. And so a lot of that's fascinating, the Afro-American history and how they treat history there for them and stuff like that. And Betty Staley at Rudolf Steiner College is very much involved in how Waldorf methods, let's put it that way, can be instituted in schools. I struggle with it personally because I worry about how people can carry what I consider the essentials needed to be a Waldorf teacher and not be accused of church and state kind of issues.
Yeah.
And I do. I just struggle with it. I'm not saying I have a strong opinion on it, but I worry because there's been people. There's the PLANS group, PLANS. There's a man named Dan Dugan involved in this, and they're just after this. And every time they've gotten it into the courts have examined this and said, anthroposophy is not a religion, it's a philosophy. So thank goodness, in a certain sense, that there's kind of a perspicacity on the part of these judges to see that, rather than these people, I think, who have very hardened opinions that they kind of dig into them, and they can't get rid of them.
Well, that's an interesting subject because I've been reading a lot about the history of philosophy lately, and I've been debating about it with an old professor of mine as well, about what the boundaries are between religion and philosophy. And do you know anything about the way the courts seem to be dividing these two disciplines?
That's a good question. I don't, and I want to speculate, but I better not. I really actually don't, yeah. Well, it's taking that idea, if I may, for a second. Think about Steiner's other big idea that I think people it's wonderful for them to consider, right, if I could throw this out. And that is this profound notion that consciousness has undergone an evolution, right, since, let's say, go back to Aristotle's time and, of course, way before, but that there's been an evolution of consciousness, and in that evolution, people's cognition of the outer and the inner worlds has undergone profound transformations. Don't you think that's just really quite a thought? In our world, it's like, oh, what are you, nuts? Those people were just idiots 2,000 years ago. Look at them, for heaven's sake. They poured their toiletry right down the middle of the street, for heaven's sake. They're dumb, right? That's what our modern modality of consciousness, and we're fixed, imagine this, we're fixed in a rock-solid idea, unbelievable prejudice, I think, that cognition, as we have it today, is exactly the same. And ours is pure materialism. I think of it now as like our consciousness is almost like suffering under the blunt force trauma of physical sense perceptions, right? It's just beating us into this, the physical world is all that's real, And we imagine the Egyptians that were that way. Steiner says you couldn't possibly be more wrong. So then when we talk about theology and philosophy, it gets interesting because, again, when you go into the past, those things become what? Natural philosophy, right, where they were together. And then even before that, we could imagine how they were the same and that bifurcation occurred over time. Again, according to the evolution of consciousness,